come all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. Oh, come ye, oh, come.
Most people think that food franchises are enormously profitable. Buy a big name food franchise and you're set for life. And most people who have this dream, they speak to a single food franchise if they have the money. They never compare these to anything else, and they never know if there were better options out there. Today, we're going to look at top reasons why you might not want to buy a food franchise. So first off, according to a Franchise Business Review report, 51.5% of food franchises earn profits of less than $50,000 a year. Only about 7% are over $250,000. The average profit for all restaurants comes in at just over $82,000 a year. A very small number of food franchises actually create substantial profits, and we see many owners are struggling or just bought themselves a job. So before we begin, if you look on the About Us page at franchise.city, you see that several of us have owned food franchises. Some of us have owned multiple units. We also have the founders of several food franchises here on the team. And I've spoken with hundreds and hundreds of food franchise owners over the years. And most importantly, we have access to all of the data, all of the financials of every single franchise in the world right here in our database. So when it comes to these types of franchises, we know what we're talking about. Now, for some people, in certain areas, a food franchise might be the best option. Every single situation, of course, is different. Your operational skills, your local demographic, the market demand, and all these other factors are all going to make a difference. But in a situation where you have an executive or someone who has business professional experience, someone who can leverage these skills and build up a business proactively, there are many profitable, lower cost alternatives to a food franchise. You have to remember, a food franchise is limited by the walk-in traffic in the surrounding local area, while these B2B types of franchises, they allow the owner to get out there and proactively build that business, scale right up through networking or local marketing. So that's the number one reason why a food franchise might not be a fit for you, is you're somewhat limited as far as getting out there and building and scaling your business. Next up, food franchises are a huge investment. McDonald's, 1.2 to 2.2 million. Taco Bell, 1.1 to 2.8 million. Burger King, 1.8 to 3.2 million. Tim Hortons here in Canada, about $1 million to $2 million. And this does not include your real estate. People think, oh, I'll just lease the building and it'll be cheaper. These are your costs with leasing the building. You're going to have to add in a few more million if you actually buy the real estate. So if the real estate is not included, why are these franchises so expensive? So just the improvements for building out a Burger King is between $900,000 to $1 million. Landscaping, you're looking at $25,000 to $60,000. Their decor package is $45,000 to $90,000. Your inventory control and order taking system, $35,000 to $110,000. Signage and drive-through, you're looking at $66,000 to $166,000. Your equipment for that Burger King is going to run you from $199,000 to new $294,000. And we haven't even covered costs for your architectural drawings, your zoning, your insurance, your working capital, your pre-operating expenses. You get the idea. When you have a brick and mortar location, regardless if it's food or anything else, your expenses go way up. And when you have $2 million invested, you have to sell a heck of a lot of French fries to make your money back. Now, the counter argument that we hear people say is that you earn millions a year in revenue. Now, the mean average sales for a franchisee-owned store in the Burger King system is $1.4 million a year gross. Now, once you back out your royalties, your food costs, your leasing, your insurance, your payroll, you've got, 50 employees? Many of these big-name food franchises have single-digit margins. Burger King margins have been suggested to average around 6%. 10%, some locations more, of course, some less. That's about $84,000 a year in profit. Even at a 10% double-digit margin, you're making $140,000, which means it's going to take you about 15 years just to pay back that money you initially invested. Next up, something you're looking at with a food franchise is remodeling. And there's nothing worse, as you know, as a consumer, when you go into a restaurant and it's old and shabby looking. But as a franchise owner, you're going to pay for those updates out of your own pocket. We always ask our clients, check the FDD for their remodeling requirements. And most franchises, and rightfully so, they require their owners to update the restaurant every few years. Now, that cost is not cheap. It's usually in the $200,000 or higher range. And the franchise legally obliges you to do so, or you'll be fined or may even lose your franchise. Next up, the food franchise industry is highly competitive. Never so competitive before in history, and thousands of food franchises over the years have entered into this market, and you'll be competing against other brands as well as your own brand, likely just a few blocks away. And there's been a trend over the past few years in many major food franchises where we're seeing declining revenues year over year due to this local competition. And that brings us to the next potential problem in food franchises, which are failure rates. And we all know that growth in anything cannot continue forever. Franchises, like anything else, they've got a life cycle, and we see strong and solid growth followed by a leveling off and then an eventual decline. The problem is that most people, same as in stocks, real estate, and investments in general, they're going to dive in right at the peak just before the decline. That's the heat up moment, and that's when everybody jumps on board. Subway, arguably the most successful food franchise, they closed 2,000 stores over the past few years. And some of these large or highly established brands are likely in a similar situation where you have major market saturation and very few premium territories remaining. Don't forget, if you're getting into one of these super established franchises, you get the leftovers of what's not been taken over the past few decades. Next up are expensive rent. And this might change in the coming months as we see stores closing. But as of the past few years, rents have been at a ridiculous premium, especially in some states like New York or California. All across the country, it's been pretty bad. But in certain cities, we have problems even finding a location, let alone finding a reasonably priced location. And certain cities have a 2 to 3% commercial vacancy rate. A lot of people don't think about this. They go in, they buy their franchise, and then they can't find a location. These are things that you should consider and look for before investing any money. Now, many food franchises, they require special venting and traffic counts, and can be even more expensive to lease than just a regular location. With a food franchise or any brick and mortar store, you could also be on the hook, remember this, for a multi-year lease, which is an obligation often for hundreds of thousands of dollars that you might be asked to personally guarantee. So if something happens to your business in the first year, first few months, you can't continue. You may be personally on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Next up, and we alluded to this earlier, you've got years to achieve your ROI. We've got franchises here that we work with that have a lower investment, anywhere from $40,000 to $70,000, that show ROI in 120 days on average. Now, when you drop $1 million or $2 million into a franchise, you pay high rents, you've got 50 or more employees, your time to ROI is going to take much longer. And this is something you have to consider in the equation. Next up, and people never really think about this, is your investment is not really guaranteed. A lot of people have this misperception that the longer a franchise has been around, the more secure your investment is going to be. And it's interesting, the failure statistics actually show a 2% variance. That's it. Between startup brands that have 5 locations or less, emerging brands that have between 5 to 50 locations, and highly established brands. There's only a 2% variance in failures between all those markets. Now, when you consider the upside that you can get from an emerging brand, such as the ability to own master franchising rights, better locations that are available, and all these other considerations, it can make sense to align yourself with an emerging brand. Now, especially if you do the food route, they can have that competitive advantage that can help you actually make more money than some of these standard brands. And last but not least, spoilage and theft. Those are the realities of a food business that are absent in other business like your salons or your service-based industries. So what are some of your alternatives instead of a food franchise? Well, if you really like the food industry, a catering type of business can be an option. It's no brick and mortar. It's a lower investment, much lower overhead, and you can make in most cases, pretty much the same as what you'd make with a brick and mortar franchise brand, and you can give us a call for details on that. Now, if you go outside of food, there are many service-based franchises that operate from a small or home office that can generate the same $1 million revenues as a food franchise for a fraction of the cost, say around $100,000 instead of this $1 million investment. Now, the best franchise for your situation is going to depend on your skills, your exit strategy, your local market demand, and many other factors. If you need help.
Gluten sensitivity can look like depression and ADD. That's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm Dr. Tracy Marks, a psychiatrist, and this channel is about mental health education and self-improvement. I publish videos weekly on Wednesdays, so if you don't want to miss one, just click subscribe. Gluten sensitivity can look like depression and ADHD, and in this case, the gluten sensitivity is the non-celiac form. So if you don't have celiac disease, you can have a sensitivity to gluten that may or may not affect your gastrointestinal system, but can also produce mental symptoms and other physical symptoms. So what's gluten? Gluten is a protein that's naturally found in grains such as wheat, barley, and rye. Those are the three main sources. Oats are gluten-free, provided that they're grown and processed in a gluten-free environment. Sometimes they're processed with other grains, and so you can get cross-contamination, but in general, as far as their makeup is concerned, they are gluten-free. Some other gluten-free examples would be amaranth, millet, and quinoa. Gluten is like a glue that helps, it's a protein, but like a glue that helps the grain keep its shape. And sometimes bakers will add gluten to a recipe to enhance the shape and texture of a bread. So first, let me tell you what celiac disease is about, and then I'll tell you what non-celiac gluten sensitivity is. Celiac disease is a form of gluten intolerance where people who are affected have an autoimmune reaction to the gluten protein. So this means that you form antibodies to the gluten protein, and in general, antibodies are your body's armies to fight off bacteria and virus. So antibodies are good, except if they're attacking your body, and that's what we call autoimmunity. So with celiac disease, antibodies form against the gluten, and these antibodies attack similar proteins in the small intestines. And when this happens, you have trouble absorbing the nutrients from your food. So celiac disease it's not that common. It happens about 1 in 140 people in the US have full-blown celiac disease. And if you have it, it's the kind of thing that it's disruptive enough to your life that you'd know it starting in childhood. But then there's this whole group of people who don't have full-blown celiac disease, but they do have a gluten sensitivity, whereby they can have symptoms that may or may not affect their intestines, but they may have abdominal pain, joint pain, fatigue, headaches, and even skin rashes. And in addition to all of that, they can also get symptoms that look like depression and thinking problems that people will describe as a brain fog. So how can you tell the difference between a regular depression and a depression that would come from gluten sensitivity? It's not always that straightforward, but one clue may be that along with your depression symptoms, that you've got other physical symptoms such as joint pain and headaches, and you find yourself having multiple doctors addressing all these different problems. Unfortunately, we don't have a straightforward way to diagnose non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There is some gluten sensitivity testing, but you can get false negatives with these. And then more sophisticated testing is expensive. But if you suspect that you have gluten sensitivity because you have some of the problems that I've mentioned, and the standard treatments for these problems don't seem to take care of all of the different problems, you can try a gluten elimination diet where you remove gluten from your diet and see how you feel. Now, you would have to be gluten-free for 4 to 6 weeks. And then what is normally done is then you reintroduce gluten back into your diet to see if how your body reacts. So here's the tricky part. Going gluten-free is not that easy, and it's not something you want to do just because. Gluten-free is trendy now, so there's lots of options to get gluten-free foods, but many of these are processed with hydrogenated oils and high fructose corn syrup. And so they're pretty unhealthy and low in nutrients. The real way to go gluten-free is to avoid the foods that are made with these grains. And because grain-based foods are so abundant, you've really got to do some work to figure out how to change your diet. So you can try eating other grain-free foods such as quinoa, oats, and rice. Another reason you don't want to whimsically go gluten-free is that the whole grains contain B vitamins, folic acid, fiber, and other nutrients. And some diets, like the Mediterranean diet, have shown to lower the risk of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And this diet includes whole grains. So if you're going to do this, you need to weigh the risks, the benefits, the pros, the cons. Also, you need to be all in on the gluten-free thing, which means paying close attention to hidden sources of gluten, like in soups that use wheat starch or barley-containing foods. I have seen it make a big difference for some people. If you're going to do it, though, you do need to give the trial a good 4 to 6 weeks. In the studies talking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that was a time frame that they used for the gluten-free elimination diet.
Police in Brooklyn are trying to track down a suspect who robbed 2 EMTs at gunpoint. The ambulance crew apparently lured there by a false 911 call. This is the second incident this week. CBS 2's Kieran Dillon is in East Williamsburg with the latest on that. Kieran.
Well, Natalie, ambulance workers here in the city are now being warned to keep their guard up after these 2 troubling robberies, one of them taking place inside the Cooper Park houses right here behind me in Brooklyn. Now, police say this most recent incident took place early this morning around 2:30. Officials say 2 FDNY emergency medical technicians were here responding to a call of a person having a seizure when they were approached by a man with a gun and robbed. The person then took off with their radios and medical bags. And it was a similar story on Monday night in Brownsville. In that incident, police say 2 hospital EMTs were also robbed while in an elevator inside the Seth Low houses. They were responding to a call for a person with breathing troubles. It's believed a man hit the emergency stop button and demanded the EMTs hand over their medical bags, tablets, and radios. Police say in both cases, the calls ended up being bogus. Meanwhile, the union that represents the FDNY EMT says the robberies are incredibly disturbing.
It's troublesome. It's one of those things that we've been screaming how dangerous our job is for so long, and now it seems to be escalating. We get assaulted at an alarming rate on a day-to-day basis to begin with, and now these assaults are escalating almost to felony levels. And you hear about a young crew just out onto the street, having to deal with actual guns being pulled on them and being robbed just for responding to a 911 call for help. It's scary.
Is your life really a reflection of who you are? Or is it a result of what happened to you? Are you the woman that God created you to be? Or are you what's left of her? Do you think that you are the man that God had in mind when he breathed into you the breath of life? The doctor slapped your bottom and your mama cried and said, it's a boy. Were you birthed for this? This is all you're going to do with life? While people gasp in intensive care, gasping for a life that you have right now, this is all you're going to do with life? It doesn't matter where you came from, what you're into, what you did, or who you did it with. Jesus died for you, shed his blood, gave his life for you, got up out the grave to show you how to get up out of yours. And now you're standing here right at the door of opportunity, at the gate of possibility. You're standing on the bridge of miracle-working power. Would you come this close and go back to the sewer and the system and the struggle and the sorrow and the restlessness and the confusion and the arguing and the bickering and the crazy stuff? Oh, God, is there anybody tired of being in their grave while heads are bowed and eyes are closed and people? I know my church, I got a praying church. People all around you are praying right now. Jesus said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open up the door and open up the door and open up the door, I will come in and sup with him, and I shall be his God and he shall be my people. Why don't you open up that old calloused hard door? That wall you built to protect yourself has now incarcerated you.